let's get cranking. Miller, let's go ahead and have you come forward. You're distracted enough in second bell without the squad around you. So, no, seriously, I just want you to scoot forward a little bit. Max said that you didn't put on deodorant today, so.
There you go. Wait, but this I don't want to be
on your leg.
What's your leg? Or turn the podium around and right inside the podium.
Can I still one of these?
Dr. Coates, will you shut that? Yes.
Sure. Doctor. Look how professional that camera is. You got it.
It's stressful.
You can sit here, that's fine. Emery tends to like pick her toes and stuff during class. Just heads up.
You know, it's actually.
You got to pass.
No, not again.
No, she's being Danielle.
Sit on the floor.
What?
Yeah, you're gone too long.
Michael hit the right one. Marymount High School. Okay, perfect. All right, here we go. All right. We kind of left off in the same place as yesterday, talking about the end of, or the beginning of communism, when we talked about our three different policies. Today, I would like to get through and talk about the controversy in Berlin. I'd like to talk about NATO versus Warsaw Pact, and I want to talk about how communism begins to spread around the globe, whether it's in China or Korea. Those are kind of things that I want to get through today, all right? Please continue with your reading tonight, and you'll kind of get through most of the Cold War if you get through your reading for tonight, okay? Second bellers, I think there's maybe a 50-50 chance that I'll see you tomorrow, okay? Here's hoping that you take the right test tomorrow. And then Tuesday we'll finish everything up, and then we'll start reviewing. Okay. If I do not see you guys tomorrow, second bell, all that kind of stuff, don't forget we're here at 8:30 on Saturday. Please be on time. Please respect everybody else's time and my time, and be here on time. Okay. Bring breakfast. That's fine. But let's not be strolling in at 9 o'clock. Yes?
It's okay, we have to leave early.
Yeah, that's fine. Now, we can't do the whole, Hobart thing where I'm going to show up for 7 minutes and try and get the extra credit and leave. Yeah. You gotta be here at least for an hour.
Okay.
It's extra credit. So. Okay. Yesterday, we talked about how do we keep communism where it is. So the two plans that we talked about, Wilson? The two plans that we talked about in trying to keep communism where it is.
The Marshall Plan and the Truman Doctrine.
Okay, very good. So in one sentence for me, Gracie, tell me the difference between the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan.
The Truman Doctrine was all about containment and keeping communism in the Soviet Union, and the Marshall Plan was giving money to countries to stop the spread of communism.
Okay, so let me just specify a little bit there. Within the Truman Doctrine, how did they promise to contain communism and keep it where it is? Okay, very good. So within Truman Doctrine, remember TNT, they promised troops. And then Marshall Plan. Jackson, who's eligible for the money within the Marshall Plan?
Anyone who's not communist in Western Europe.
Okay, very good. All right. So this is a good time to introduce the idea of the Iron Curtain. I think you know what it is. But basically, the Marshall Plan was any money promised to anybody on this side of the Iron Curtain. Okay? Now, obvious statement of the day, but because Danielle's here, I need to say it. It actually didn't exist. There was not an Iron Curtain that descended from the sky and split Europe in half. Okay? Why does Churchill call it an Iron Curtain, though, Nate?
Maybe it's hard to penetrate it.
Okay, very good. If it's iron, you can't get through it. What about the curtains?
Can't see what's behind.
Yeah, you can't go over it. You can't go, around it. You can't go under it. It closes everything off. So when Churchill gives his Iron Curtain speech in Missouri, of all places, but whatever, he talks about the Iron Curtain. It's basically saying we have this philosophical divide between good and bad, between East and West, and we kind of have no idea about what's going on in Eastern Europe. But in order to keep communism from spreading across that Iron Curtain, let's pump billions of dollars into Western Europe so that we can increase our chances of abating communism. Yeah, Alex.
So, but they gave money to Greece and Turkey, right?
Yeah, within, and I don't say this a lot because it confuses people, but within the Truman Doctrine, they did promise monetary support as well as troops. Okay, so, but the Marshall Plan is really just money to the Western European countries. Okay, yes, your Greece got troops and money. Okay. I mean, foundation of democracy, right? We can't let Greece turn communist. I mean, that's a bad sign. All right. Questions on this? All right, so where do these tensions really, really start to take place? First is that they take place in Berlin. Sixth bell, we did not get to this yesterday. Second bell, we did, but you had faded on me. So, let's review this real quick. Following World War II, Germany is a mess. Obviously, Hitler is dead. The Nazis are finished. So they divide Germany into 4 sections. The 4 winning Allied powers. This makes sense. What's the problem, Lucy, with the French and the British?
They don't like each other.
Well, yeah, I mean, going back 1,000 years. But what's the problem with their control in Germany?
I don't know. Sorry. Money? They're broke?
Yeah, they don't have any money. They can't control an entire sector within Germany. They don't have any money. Okay? So, the British and the French essentially cede their land to the Americans. You have it. The Americans are certainly willing and able and happy to take this land. So we got the British, the American, and the French zone, which essentially turns into West Germany. The Soviet zone turns into East Germany. Abby, as Grandpa used to say, what is the fly in the ointment here?
Are you asking
Yeah, actually, I know you're going to write it down, but I want you to answer it too.
what the problem is?
What's the fly in the ointment?
Well, Berlin is in East Germany.
So who cares? It's just a city.
Well, we're America, and it's the crown jewel of Germany, and it pisses us off that the communists have it.
Starting to talk like me. I love it. Very good. Berlin is the crown jewel. It's, you ready for this? West Berlin, which the United States had occupied at this point, the oasis of democracy. How about that? Flow of poetry on your Thursday afternoon. Miller, that's when things rhyme. Okay, so Berlin, stuck within the Soviet sector, Stalin wants to keep the Americans out of West Berlin. He wants what he calls a buffer zone. He wants a nice divide between the dirty, stinking capitalists and his nice, calm communists. So, Stalin, smartly, no dummy, cuts off West Berlin. Okay, Matthew, come on up here. You, of course, are the budding capitalist, so you will be the Americans. If you could stand here, please. Very good. Wave to the camera. Very good. It's a face for radio.
Thank you.
As Grandpa used to say. So I need you to be the Americans. So here out of the light. Okay. Now, I'm the communist. This is Berlin. I'm going to step up here, and I'm going to blockade West Berlin. Again, Stalin's no dummy. He has taken the ball, and he has put it squarely in the court of the Americans. Okay, I'm blocking West Berlin. You're Harry Truman, Matthew McGrory, the Americans. You have two options. Option one, you're going to go through me, and then everybody in the world is going to say, hey, the Americans started World War III. Truman really doesn't want that option. Option two, nope.
No, not possible.
Nope.
Over.
Are you escaping prison? Option two is they leave West Berlin. And now, the Americans, the first time that the Soviets have stood up to them, they put their tail between their legs and they run away. Truman can't do that either. He can't go through because he can't start World War III. He can't turn around and basically, blink first in this Cold War. Truman, smart guy, does what? Your answer from earlier.
Which one? I have lots of answers from earlier.
Okay.
This one?
No, because
This
I'm
one?
going to no.
No.
This one or this one start World War III.
This one.
This one takes the ball and puts it back in Stalin's court. I'm going to airlift in all of the supplies to the blockaded West Berliners. So now Stalin can shoot down the planes. Now he's starting World War III, or he can let it happen. So Truman outmaneuvers Stalin. He wins. I'm going to use the word battle here, but we know that it's not a battle. But he wins the first, the first chess move of the Cold War. And that's what we call in 1947, 1948, the Berlin Airlift. It's the first time that the tensions really could have gone hot enough to go to the Cold War turning hot, but cooler heads prevail. Thank you. Great job. So what we see here is that the British and the Americans literally drop in supplies to West Berlin. The crazy thing about this, 327 days. Kaylee, that's almost a year, because there's 365 days in a year. Okay? So for almost a year, the Americans and the British drop in supplies to West Berlin. Here's the craziest thing that I think of with the West Berliners. Plastic wasn't invented yet. It had just come about during World War II, and it was only a military development at this point. So it's not like we're dropping in, bottled water. Well, we're dropping it, but it's in glass. So here we got the milk bottle is going to be parachuted in to West Berlin. Hey, honey, I'm going to the grocery store. 327 days, that's pretty impressive. And think about all of the supplies that you would have to drop to feed a city. I mean, not only food and water, but, all of the other, necessary supplies for daily life. Got to drop in toilet paper. I was teaching this last week to my CP juniors, and I had a kid in first over. Mr. Hanley, do you know, the percentage of bottles that were broken during the Berlin Airlift? No, sorry, I did not pick up that intricate piece of data during my college classes. No, Cameron, I don't know. Oh, okay.
What was Germany doing while this was all going on? Like the government, where
Doesn't exist. You're either the West Germans, and you are essentially ruled by the Americans, and you are a budding democracy and capitalist economy, or you're East Germany, and you are essentially a satellite nation of the Soviet Union. The country that we know as Germany does not re-exist until East Germany and West Germany are unified in 1990. So West Germany was its own country for 45 years, as was East Germany. Different hockey teams, right? Different Olympic. Two separate countries.
How's that work with the Olympic teams? If all the countries are just puppet countries of the Soviet Union.
Why do you think the hockey team was so good?
Well, yes. So
Right? They were the ultimate all-star team. I'll take a kid out of Yugoslavia, Romania, whatever. Okay, you're Soviet.
And so
right?
there's no Romania doesn't have its own.
No, they did, but they were, of
But
course,
they were-
the JV squad to the big boys.
So it's like you play Russia and you score on yourself because it's
Right. Yeah.
we're all praising.
Exactly.
Okay.
Questions on Berlin? Okay. Come on back up.
All right.
As a result of the Berlin Airlift, if he would have tried to come through me. I need friends who are going to support me in a fight. As does he. He needs friends. So the Berlin Airlift and the controversy over Berlin leads to the development of military alliances during the Cold War. So I need you to write both of these down. Great job. Okay. The development of military alliances. Of course, we know that they are
NATO and the Warsaw Pact.
NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Okay? The good guy one is NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. First time U.S. enters into a military alliance during peacetime. And Rochelle, what do you think that the countries involved in NATO all had in common? Don't overthink this one, sister. Yeah, they were certainly democracies. Good. What else?
They were afraid of Soviet aggression.
They were certainly afraid of Soviet aggression. Jackson?
They were all in the North Atlantic.
Thank you. Very good. They all touched the North Atlantic. We even got the 7 people who live in Greenland to be involved within NATO.
Oh, yeah.
Isn't that the same sound for the step into a Slim Jim?
Those Kool-Aid Man.
Oh, gotcha.
Step into a sunset.
What's second to this?
Okay. In response to NATO, we have the development of the Warsaw Pact. Daniel Keyes, where's Warsaw?
I have no
I
idea.
can't for that one.
There's one in Kentucky.
There is one in Kentucky. This was not the Warsaw Pact. Shelley, Chance of Redemption. It is not in Poland. Okay, yeah, very good. Okay, so Warsaw, one of the major cities in Poland. It was, don't forget, the Warsaw Ghetto was the biggest ghetto and collection of Jews in the middle of the Holocaust before they were shipped to the concentration camps. So it makes sense that the Soviet alliance behind the Iron Curtain here is going to be the Warsaw Pact. Okay, in the midst of the satellite nations. Why not the Moscow Pact?
Because we're all in this together.
Perfect. Very good. Okay. That if it's the Moscow Pact, it looks like the Soviet Union is forcing them to join. If it's the Warsaw Pact, oh look, the satellite nations are, they want to be in it as well. They're not being forced into it, which we know is crap. But it's got a little bit better of a publicity angle. Were you going to attempt to take any sort of assessment in this class at any point, or should we just schedule it for July?
We said after school today. Yesterday, right?
Fine, that's fine. Zach.
If Yugoslavia was communist, why didn't they join Warsaw Pact?
They are them and Hungary are kind of the redheaded, excuse the pun, of the Soviet Union. The Yugoslavia is kind of they are not fully involved. They kind of try and put in their own, as does Hungary, but especially Yugoslavia, they try and put in their own type of communism, more of the Marxist rather than the Leninist and Stalinist, and so that's why they don't join. They're constantly at odds with the Soviet Union. Good question, Jackson.
Why do they even need is Warsaw Pact just kind of like a figure? I don't want to say figure. It doesn't make sense, but
Like a formality.
aren't they all part of the Soviet Union? Like they're all like states in the United States. Like so, wouldn't if West Germany?
I don't want to. I want to stop you there because I don't want to call them states within the United States. They're almost, to go back to talk about imperialism, it's either a protectorate or a sphere of influence. I mean, Romania is its own country, but of course they're under the wing of Big Brother, Soviet Union. So I think I do think it's from a publicity state, but they are not a state of it. I mean,
They're not a part of.
they are part of the Soviet Union, right? But they are not a state within it. They have a little bit more. I know this sounds weird talking about communism, but they have a little bit more freedom than what Alabama does within the United States.
So then, like,
Alabama cannot enter themselves into the Olympics.
is
Most people from Alabama can't spell Olympic, but that's okay. So I mean, it's tough to kind of find where it is. They're certainly being forced into the Warsaw Pact, right? But they are not as controlled as what a state would be within the United States.
so they're not. So the Soviet Union and the USSR are different.
No.
What's that? Well, let's look at.
Okay. No, so there's states within the Soviet Union like Russia, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and they don't have borders on the map. If they do have borders on the map, they're not technically part of the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union basically owns them and they control their country, even though they're technically their own country.
So the Soviet
I'll drop
Union goes to
It's
war.
okay.
And they do.
Go ahead. I'll drop
They kind of do though because the Soviet Union doesn't
I
control their own.
But then why do they have to join that?
It's the mentality problem.
USSR is United
It's just
Soviet
Soviet Socialist Republic.
So the Soviet put that up there. So like the Cuban Missile Crisis, like when we blockaded Cuba, the USSR came in and brought their ships in, and it was like the highest freak out in the Cold War.
Yes.
And isn't like if we kind of invaded one of those countries, like from the Soviet bloc, then isn't it the same thing as Cuba being one of the Eastern European nations? Because Russia has to protect them.
So you're saying that if we would have actually fired on Cuba, that's the same as firing on the Soviet Union?
Well, is that no? Well, no, but like, I mean, isn't it a protectorate? Like we had.
Was Cuba a protectorate of us or of the Soviet
Of
Union?
the Soviet Union.
Yes.
But weren't all the Eastern European nations?
Yeah, but Cuba to a far lesser extent because they weren't necessarily a satellite nation. They were a independent communist country, but the only way that they were able to succeed is because they had the backing of the Soviet Union. The same thing with North Korea and the same thing with North Vietnam. They weren't a satellite nation, but North Korea and North Vietnam, they are their own independent communist nation, but they get lots and lots of help from China and the Soviet Union. The same thing with Cuba. Russia, the Soviet Union, whatever, they could care less whether Cuba was communist or not, to be honest with them. But they certainly are going to go and they're going to put their arm around Cuba because it's 90 miles away. And they know that that's making us pee our pants.
Is that kind of like the same thing with when Israel first becomes a state and they only exist because like we helped them?
Yes. Maybe still today, but that's another conversation. Okay. Questions on Berlin? Questions on NATO versus the Warsaw Pact? Okay. Now, I mentioned this yesterday. In 1949, the domino theory is truly proven to be correct when on October 1st of 1949, China becomes communist. This sets the United States into full-blown, excuse the pun, red alert. Okay? They are truly, truly worried about communism now. It's one thing if it stays here. It's another thing if it creeps into Eastern Europe, into all those countries that we really don't care about, nor do we know how to spell. Another thing if it creeps into China, because now the two most powerful and biggest countries in the world, outside of the United States, are communist. The red menace exists, and it's spreading. That nasty, using pusticivi, leaky, crusty, pick your scab and eat it disease, it lives, and it spreads. Not to mention, salt in the wounds is that we were supporting the other side within the Chinese Civil War. Quick background history. In 1945, the Japanese leave, and everybody in China looks at each other and they're like, wait, who's in charge? I don't want you writing any of this down, please. It's not necessary. 1945, the Japanese are gone. They had controlled China since 1931, and the Japanese had invaded Manchuria. So for 14 years, Japan had been in control. Suddenly, they're looking around, they're like, who's in charge? Is it you? Is it me? Is it you? I hope not. Okay. The Nationalists versus the communists. Here's the really crazy thing, and this shows how things are different. The Nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek, he's basically a fascist. And he's supported by the United States. We had just spent 4 to 5 years trying to eradicate fascism from Europe, and we're supporting a fascist. Not by troops, but by military advisors and tons of military supplies and money. We're giving him to Chiang Kai-shek, and he loses to the communist-backed leader Mao Zedong. Okay, Red Scarf Girl, you read it? Okay, did you actually read it, or did you just spark note it?
I read it.
Actually read it? 2 whole students? Congratulations. Okay.
I only read it for an independent thing.
CP.
Okay, anyway. So, the communist Mao Zedong, they turn China communist. October 1st, 1949, that is their July 4th. That's their Independence Day. Even today, obviously still communist, that is a national holiday. For those of you who are a little interested in 21st century current events, the losing side, the Nationalists, tail between their legs, they retreat to the island of Taiwan. Okay? Today, Taiwan and China have weapons pointed at each other. They're still bitter about the Civil War from 1945 to 1949. Okay? One of my friends and roommates in college was Taiwanese. His parents came here in the 1970s. He was born here in Virginia in the 1980s. His grandfather had been a supporter of Kai-shek and the Nationalists and was imprisoned by the communists for 20 years. Okay, the tensions still run pretty hot between Taiwan and China. Ironically, when China turns communist, ready for this? When China turns communist in 1949, the United States pretends that does not exist. They taught it in school that this does not exist. And this was China.
Yay, propaganda.
From 1949 until 1972, that was taught as the country of China. We pretended that this big sucker did not exist. And then in 1972, President Nixon flies to meet with Mao Zedong, and then suddenly, like the spurned mistress, we're like, hey, Taiwan, you don't exist anymore, and now we shake hands and we become friends, and this is China again. Yeah, foreign policy. Ready for the kicker? Do you know what makes China, real China, big China, communist China, China and the United States, do you know what warms up the relations?
Money.
Oh yeah.
What you said? Ping pong.
Oh, right, yeah, I remember this.
I wrote a 20-page paper my junior year in college on U.S.-China relations, and my 20-page term paper was on ping pong diplomacy. Because the Chinese team had the number 1 ping pong team, the U.S. had the number 2 ping pong team, and they actually played each other. And so when the Chinese came here to the United States, they looked around, they're like, wait, this isn't this monstrous nation that we've been told about for 25 years. And then the Chinese and American ping-pongers got along, that the Chinese invited the Americans back. The Americans are like, oh, China isn't that bad. It's Forrest Gump in the land of China. That's all it is. But seriously, Chinese-U.S. relations over ping pong. Miller, everything okay? Are you still laughing about your racist comment earlier, or have you moved on from that? Perfect. Yeah.
I know this happened like in the early Soviet Union. When China was being communist, did they like try to shut out all foreigners and not let anyone in, and that's why we didn't know what was going on in China at the time? Or?
Yeah. And again, and I think I said this the other day, if Mao and Stalin don't agree, Mao and Khrushchev don't agree, if they would have ever joined forces, Katie Barton. Yeah.
So, how did we exactly view China? Because, like, it's not. Did we view it as like? I know you said it doesn't exist, or like that little
Just like Cuba doesn't exist. There were no. You sit over there and then you start breaking things. There were just no diplomatic relations. There were no trade relations. So now, in the 4th grade world map quiz, did we say which? I don't know. That was 1960. I don't know.
Well, like, did they consider it part of like?
It's because we recognize the entire Chinese mainland as owned by the Republic of China, which was Taiwan,
Yeah.
and it's still Taiwan, and we didn't recognize the People's Republic of China as a sovereign country.
Okay. So it's kind of like the way that in the Civil War, when Great Britain doesn't acknowledge the South as being its own country, and neither is America, or like the North.
They are states in rebellion.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Perfect. Okay. All right. So China becomes communist. Back to the original point. Is, oh my goodness, the domino theory is now going both ways. Because look at what happens. In looking here at this map, in 1949, China becomes communist. In 1950, Korea becomes communist. By 1955, Vietnam becomes communist. By 1960, Cuba, oh God, becomes communist. So the Cold War tensions are building and building and building, almost like a roller coaster. It starts calm, then Berlin Airlift, NATO, Warsaw Pact, China, Korea, Vietnam, Cuba, and they say that the high point, the zenith, okay, the climax of the Cold War comes in 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. So everything is really building to that high point of tension that happens in Cuba when the United States and Soviet Union really start staring eye to eye. Jackson.
I understand that China and the Soviet Union disagree with each other, but since the United States helped the nationalists in China, and since the Soviet Union and China were both communist and anti-capitalist, why didn't they join forces, fight the lesser of two evils?
Truly philosophical differences. I mean, you're going to say, I'm resigning from AP Euro because Mr. Hanley and I have philosophical differences. Okay? Mao and Stalin. Mao was a Marxist, and Stalin says no. There's a different way of doing it, and the actual implementation of Marxism and communism on a large scale existence, they disagreed. They didn't like each other. Each thought that their way was better, and so they while they were paper allies. I mean, they were friends on paper. For the most part, there was really not a lot of true communist buddy stuff going on.
What about when Khrushchev? Why didn't they?
A little bit better, but I mean, again, Khrushchev was just continuing what Stalin was doing, and at that point, Mao had kind of implemented his own system, and he had been communist dictator for so long that he felt like he didn't need support from the Soviet Union. He was doing it his way now. Okay. Heimdall.
Wasn't, I don't know if you said this or not, wasn't Yugoslavia not part of the Warsaw Pact but still communist?
Yes. Yeah, and I had talked with Zach about they wanted to do communism their own way and were constantly butting heads with Stalin and the Soviet Union.
If they weren't part of the Warsaw Pact, then did the United States care still?
Yeah, because they were still communist. We weren't happy with that, but they weren't part of the Warsaw Pact, and the Warsaw Pact was ridiculous because you don't really need allies when you're dropping nuclear bombs on each other. It's the playground buddies is what it was. Michael.
With the why were we so scared that China had become communist when Russia, with their nuclear missiles, was really close to us as well?
It's just the sheer number of people. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of millions of people are now communist.
Okay, so
that's the problem.
It was more the fact that they turned more than their location because Russia's pretty close to us as well.
Yeah. Certainly more size and numbers rather than geography.
Okay.
But the problem with that is that geography plays into it because now we got communism going into Korea and communism going into Vietnam, and in both cases, the northern part, North Korea over South Korea, North Vietnam over South Vietnam, both times the communist countries invade, which means now the South Koreans or the South Vietnamese raise their hand, and we're 15 years removed, or in one case 5 years, in one case 15 years, removed from the Truman Doctrine, but both times the South Koreans and the South Vietnamese were like, hey, you promised, and the U.S. is like, you're right. So we are involved in the Korean War and the Vietnam War, as we said yesterday, directly because of the Truman Doctrine. The the Korean War, 1950 to 1953. That's a 3 to 4 year battle by the United States as a direct result of Truman's promise in 1947. And then 1964 to 1975, we get involved in Vietnam for the exact same reasons. Both direct issues by the Truman Doctrine. Yeah.
Well, geographically, it is actually pretty close because didn't we like control Japan basically at that time?
Yeah, good point. And that was actually a big victory on our part, was actually convincing the Japanese, post-nuclear weapons, to go to a democratic and a capitalist state. And that's why we were over there for about 10 years, almost as a puppet government. Good point. Yeah.
What were our relations with the Philippines like so far?
At this point, it starts to get pretty complicated. Following World War II, because the Japanese have been there, the Americans have been there, the Americans try and reestablish the Philippines as a colony following World War II. And the Philippines are like, yeah, screw you. All of Africa is becoming decolonized. India has become decolonized. South Africa has become decolonized. And you, the writers of the Declaration of Independence, you're telling me that you're not going to allow us to be independent?
So we're kind of
And the Americans kind of farted around with it for a little bit, and then they were like, okay, you're right. Go. Okay, and actually, his last name is Aguinaldo. Emilio, he's the leader of the revolutionary forces in the Philippines, and he actually kicks our butt pretty good. And so we grant them their independence after World War II. Yeah. Well,
that if you go back to like the worldwide map, the countries of Africa, were they supported by Stalin?
these lightly colored ones?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know, to be honest with you. This was a thing that a student teacher did for me a couple years ago. I don't know if these were supported by the Soviet Union or if they were communist leanings during this time because of the light colors. My guess would be that. And
Were any attempts made on Japan to like make them communist, like did the Soviets attempt to start revolutions or anything?
no, I don't think that they wanted to. They knew that the Japanese was kind of our baby, and they didn't want to mess with that. Plus, if the Chinese are communist, the Japanese are definitely not going to be communist because they've hated each other forever, more than the British and the French.
Well, I know that Afghanistan was shit. The Soviets invaded Afghanistan.
Yeah,
Right?
1979, right?
So maybe just like places where
And Laos is the South Korea.
Which eventually turns communist, as does Cambodia. Alex Wilson.
Do the Chinese and the Japanese still hate each other?
I mean, I don't think that they're. Yeah, I mean, you got a communist country and you got a pretty, I think Japan might be our biggest ally, out there right now since we spied on the Germans. So, yeah, I mean, I don't think that they necessarily like each other very much.
That's sad because it's like if we hated Canada.
Japanese and Chinese
Okay.
different cultures.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah, I'm just moving on from that comment. Yeah.
Do people consider the Truman Doctrine effective, or like, they see it in a positive light or a negative light?
Which is the whole. So, Kayla, if you did not hear, is the Truman Doctrine effective? Which leads to the huge problems with the Vietnam War. And next year, Mrs. Leatherwood will spend a whole week talking to you about how the Vietnam War divides the U.S. home front. But 50% of the population in 1964 supports, hey, we got to go into Vietnam and we got to end the communists. And then half of the people were like, the Truman Doctrine was 20 years ago. Do I care if some place on a map 10,000 miles away that I can't spell or pronounce in the middle of a jungle, do I care if they're communist? Does that affect my day-to-day life on the east side of Cincinnati or in Iowa? No. So the Truman Doctrine, the later that it gets, the less effective it becomes. Now, was it ultimately effective? I would think so. I mean, the world didn't become communist. Today there's only 6 countries or whatever that are still communist, so yeah, probably. That would be a good short answer question, by the way. Okay. One positive notion of one thing that supports the effectiveness of the Truman Doctrine, one thing that is, that shows that the Truman Doctrine was ineffective. That would be good. Yeah, Dan.
This was in the reading, and we haven't touched on it yet, so I wanted to ask it. How is our role with Israel and the creation of that Jewish state affecting our conflict with Soviet Union?
I am going to table all of the Israel conversation until next week, because we're going to spend an entire day on Israel and Palestine, and we'll talk about communism. We're going to talk about, the impact of Islam and all of that. We'll do it all in one day, because it's too difficult to get into.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, it was in the reading. We'll touch on it.
Just what type of government in Russia today?
Democracy.
Yeah, there's a
It's-
lot
I mean,
of big
it's-
folks.
When in 1991, when communism falls, the Soviet Union ceases to exist, and those countries in Eastern Europe, the one that Jackson is angry about, they start the pro-democracy leanings, and then the Soviet Union essentially shrivels up and ends up as the Russian Republic. Okay, and again, republic more in name only. It was. I don't want to call it a dictatorship, but I mean, it was almost there was too much presidential power. Now it is a democracy. Okay, I mean, there's a prime minister, there's a president. I mean, on paper it looks right, but then Putin is doing whatever he wants. He appoints himself president, but then he appoints himself prime minister too. I mean, he's a modern day Hitler. He is.
Megalomania.
He is a megalomaniac, and he's also smart because he knows that the West does not want to go to war with him, which was the whole reason he went into Crimea and all of that, because he knows that basically people are going to back down because they don't want to start World War III, in Crimea. So we are appeasing him. He used the 2012 Winter Olympics just like Hitler used the Olympics in Berlin. Promote Russian nationalism, get everybody feeling good, and then let's go kick some ass. And that's what he did. He invaded, and we keep backing down. It'll be interesting when, let's make America great again becomes president, and then you get 2 dictators going back and forth, both with itchy trigger fingers. Alex, you and I will be in Canada at that point. Because it's basically the same as the U.S.
Just free help.
Do it.
But I don't get
I think that's a great synthesis. Not only because I came up with it, but I think it makes sense.
You're implying that Japan and China were the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's you're the modern day.
The way you said it.
No, I mean, not yesterday. I mean, the final thing that we'll talk about is... you might see a question on 9/11. That's probably as far as we'll get. The mid-90s is about it. Yeah.
The internet.
So, true. Basically, the way that the effectiveness of the UN and the League of Nations and the UN now is kind of similar positioning, where Russia, in the case of the League of Nations, Germany, or maybe no, hold on. It's like. I'm thinking of 2 things at the same time. I'm trying to get them straight. So the UN now is kind of at a point where it's not effective because of Russia, and back when the UN was created, it was effective because we could keep Russia together. Yes. Now Russia is taking advantage of that, and that makes the UN ultimately ineffective against Russia for now.
I feel like we're tiptoeing around them too much.
Yeah, it's like we're not. There's nothing.
Agreed.
Okay.
Will, eating.
Oh yeah. So, like the second most popular party in Russia's Duma is the Communist Party. So, I'm not saying they're going to get elected because Putin's doing election fraud and he'll win every time. But what if the Communist Party did get elected? Because communism isn't supposed to have elections.
Yeah, the thing is that, and this is a comparative politics class that you'll take in college, but I mean, there's Communist Party members that are in the German Parliament and the French Parliament and all of that. The thing is, with some of those European political things, it's not the two-party system that we have here. There's 3, there's 4, there's 5. So they kind of cancel each other out. So I think if communists were to get, the majority, they would just pass extremely socialist laws. I don't think that it would be a complete coup and take over. Correct.
State, it should be a state democratically led by communists.
Yes, and I mean, and essentially extreme socialist, which is the way of saying it. Jackson.
What is wrong with Yemen? Why is...
I really don't want to take time to talk about Yemen. I don't have any idea. Yeah.
Muslims, oil.
Today, like the main party of
Like, it's like
The what?
the Green Party is all about
Well, I mean, they're on ice. You got to save the ice caps, right? Okay, moving on. The final thing that I want to talk to you about today that takes the Cold War to nearly its highest level, and right before we'll talk about Cuba tomorrow, is that the United States and the Soviet Union in the 1940s, after the Soviet Union develops and tests its first atomic bomb in 1949, the U.S. and Soviet Union simply enter into what we call the arms race. Thank goodness that we don't use it, because we have MAD, mutually assured destruction, hanging over our head. So the development of the atomic bomb by Russia or the Soviet Union in 1949, that leads to the beginning of the arms race. So, U.S., nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union follows. The U.S. says, hey, anything you can do, I can do better. And then 3 years later, the U.S. comes up with the hydrogen bomb. 67 times more powerful. They do.
Really? I thought that was a joke.
No,
Wait,
that's,
you just said that.
no, that's legit.
Oh, I thought.
How much stronger is that one?
We test the hydrogen bomb in a little-known string of islands out in the Pacific called the Bikini Islands. Wonder where you get the name?
Bikini Bottom.
Anyway, this was a U.S. Navy experiment. The sailors on board of that ship today, in 2016, are still taking radiation medicine. And they were miles away from the actual explosion of the hydrogen bomb. Okay? But the sailors on the ship who saw, the ultimate, hydrogen cloud, still taking radiation 70, 80 years later. Yeah, we just got it on the camera and got the picture. Michael.
So
Bless you.
well, the space race gained the space race gained a bunch of funding because didn't the government see possible applications through the space race into military technology?
Excuse me.
Sorry.
Yeah, to answer your rudely cut short question. But yeah, the next thing that the arms race goes to is 1957, when the arms race goes to outer space, and the Soviets launch Sputnik, the first satellite into outer space. Do you guys know how big Sputnik was?
It was like the size of like a volleyball.
Yeah, a volleyball or a basketball, right? But Michael's correct. They thought that when the satellite goes into outer space, that Sputnik had nuclear capabilities. Again, they didn't know what they didn't know. The size of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki was the size of this desk. The size of Sputnik was a basketball. That doesn't work. Okay. So, the arms race, nuclear bomb, hydrogen bomb, and then finally, outer space. We'll save the controversy over whether we landed on the moon or not for after the AP test. Okay. Please write the word Cuba in your notes. We'll begin there tomorrow. As a result of Sputnik, the U.S. passes something called the National Defense Education Act. You don't need to know it, okay? But the NDEA basically said, hey kids, in high school, we got to start taking math and science because the Russians are kicking our butt, and we're hanging out with the class. That's essentially what it was.
Oh, I know. No, but